Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight we're going to talk about a number of different things, including Syria, Ukraine, and some domestic issues. Of course, we're going to talk about the Export-Import Bank. And as we're recording the show here on September 10th, 2014, almost nearly a week in advance anyway, of the time that you'll hear the show, we've got to touch on a few things regarding 9/11, and of course, the show is being recorded shortly before the speech by Barack Obama regarding his so-called strategy against ISIS. So we're going to hear what's likely to be some type of warmongering rhetoric coming from Obama and his ridiculous responsibility to protect crew. And we're also likely to hear the after effects, the responses from the Republicans after the presidential speech, stating that it's not going far enough, nothing short of World War III with nuclear weapons and entire populations being annihilated will not be accepted. So we're going to hear some of that, and of course we're going to talk about it. But again, we're a few hours away from the Obama speech as I'm recording the show. So by the time you hear this, you will know what Obama said in the speech. I don't have that luxury, although we can gather from the reports that we've had over the last week or so what the speech is going to entail. But before we get into anything, I just want to remind you that you can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on ucy.tv. You can access the show's personal webpage at ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. And on that page you'll find the RSS feed that links to my more recent articles as posted on BrandonTurbeville.com. And you'll find the chat room, and you will find the archive versions of this show, the archive files. Now, if you want to keep up with my work as it comes out, I am a regular writer for ActivistPost.com, TheAntimedia.org, and NaturalBlaze.com. But if you want to just keep track of my work specifically, then I would recommend that you go to www.BrandonTurbeville.com, and that's the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the interviews, all of the archive versions of this show, and also the website that has the bookstore. You can go click on the Books tab and order one of the 6 books that I've written there. One of them, of course, is about Syria. It's called The Road to Damascus, The Anglo-American Assault on Syria, and it's instrumental if you want to understand what's happening in Syria right now. It'll explain everything. Although the book was written about 2 years ago, you will still get a very good grasp of the Syrian situation, the Syrian crisis. Now, with the plugs out of the way, actually not out of the way. I want to mention Florence, South Carolina, 311 West Palmetto Street. We've mentioned this every week here on the show. 311 West Palmetto Street, Florence, South Carolina, 29506 at Health First Chiropractic Center. Every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. They have a meeting, they have a DVD viewing, they have a small health talk regarding information about chemtrails, about vaccines, about GMOs, that sort of thing. So if you want to get more information about it, then show up at the meeting, or if you just want to meet with like-minded people, it's another great place to be. Again, 311 West Palmetto Street, Florence, South Carolina, 29506, 7 p.m. on Tuesday nights, and it's Health First Chiropractic Center. You can also find that they're on Facebook. You can go like their page on Facebook and find their information, call them if you need direction or something. It's Florence, South Carolina, not far away from Myrtle Beach if you're heading in that direction. Also not far away from Fayetteville, North Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, a couple hours away from Charleston, South Carolina. So if you're in the area, you should stop by. Of course, I want to remind you, too, we've got a couple candidates that you might be interested in, political candidates. If you're in Nebraska, the election, Dan Burdorf is running for U.S. Senate in Nebraska coming up in the next couple of months. So we've got Dan Burdorf. His website is danfornebraska.com, and he's a great candidate. He was a guest here on this show. Dan has an excellent economic platform, and he's pro-gun, and a lot of other good things as well. We've also got James Hinton That's Hinton for Congress. That is Hinton for Congress.com. He's running out there in the 5th District of California, the U.S. House 5th District. That's the Napa Valley, Sonoma region. And he is running on a great economic platform. He's pro-gun. He's anti-GMO. Great guy. So check him out. If you're in that area, you go vote for him when the time comes. So now, with that out of the way, we got a lot of things to talk about tonight, but I want to get into some of the domestic issues first, because last week I said I was going to get into this, and I didn't because I ran out of time. And, of course, we've got pressing events to talk about this week, and as I record the show, we are on the eve of 9/11. The eve of 9/11 as I record the show. So I wanted to do a number of talks regarding 9/11 truth, but I can't. Well, it's not that I can't. It's just that by the time you hear it, it's going to be past. I should have thought a little bit ahead of time and done that last week. But regardless, hindsight's 20/20. We're going to get into the Export-Import Bank tonight, and a lot of you might, at first, look at this issue as sort of a tangential issue, something that doesn't really affect you and sound boring. Well, hopefully that won't be the case. But we need to talk about that situation and how it's a microcosm of the economic plight that we're in, and we're also going to offer some solutions here. So, what we've got, whenever you see the Democrats and the Republicans coming together on any general issue, then you have a good idea that the American people are going to be screwed. And that's the only time these parties can come together, is when they're screwing the American people. So we've got this bipartisan attack on the Export-Import Bank. It's coming from people like, we've got Republican Congressman Jeb Hensarling of Texas, and Hensarling has been attacking the bank and saying that it's corrupt, that it's a risk to American taxpayers. He's pointed out a number of major corporations that the bank has provided assistance to that have proven to be non-productive, or even anti-productive, I guess we should say, to the U.S. economy. And he's also argued that the bank violates the concept of the Austrian school of economics. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But it's not. We should say that there's others on the Republican side. It's not Hensarling seems to be leading the charge, but there's others. We've got the Koch Industries groups. We've got Americans for Prosperity. We've got Competitive Enterprise Institute and Mercatus Center, just to name a few of them. Also the Koch Industries in general. They've made it common practice to attack the Export-Import Bank, or the EXIM Bank, whatever you want to call it. So we've got there was a cartoon. The Koch Industries actually made a cartoon attacking the EXIM Bank, and it's called "Laughing All the Way to the Export-Import Bank." And it's a superhero satire called "The Cronies." I'm sorry, and the cartoon was called "Laughing All the Way to the Export-Import Bank." It's really stupid, but it's sort of the Huffington Post. They say, this is a quote: "The flood of institutional effort has made enmity toward XM a staple of popular conservatism, similar to the old hostility directed at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac." Well, end quote. That's popular conservatism, I guess. That's Republican politics. That's not what you would think of a true conservative. That's the Republicans. But the Republicans and the right-wingers are not the only ones who are attacking the Export-Import Bank. As I said, it's bipartisan, so we've got a bunch of left-wing liberal Democrats in here involved as well. And we've got, say, Florida Representative Alan Grayson. All right, everybody should know Grayson. All right, and he's been calling the EXIM Bank corporate welfare at its worst. And here's a statement by Alan Grayson. This is what he says: "We are extending the full faith and credit of the U.S. government to foreign companies when we should be extending it to the American middle class instead. When these foreign borrowers go broke one day, as they surely will, our taxpayers will end up on the hook for their debt, and all for the sake of U.S. exports that would have happened anyway." End quote. And of course, we've got the famous socialist Bernie Sanders, right? Who's been opposing the EXIM Bank. We even have candidate Obama, and of course we know candidate Obama was somewhat different than President Obama. but Obama called it cronyism. The Ex-Im Bank was cronyism. We've got Bernie, Socialist Bernie, calling the Export-Import Bank corporate welfare. We've also got a representative from Texas, Lloyd Doggett, who's been opposing the Ex-Im Bank. All this stuff, right? And we've got the fact that the Ex-Im Bank is set to be, its formal authorization is set to expire on September the 30th of this year. So that's actually the day that congressional funding for the entire federal government runs out. I know that makes libertarians and anarchists giddy, but I think if something like that were to happen, you might not be so giddy. That Austrian school economics kind of stuff, that's all interesting in theory, but in practice it's an incredibly stupid program. And it's not beneficial to anybody except big banks and big corporations. Everybody else it's squashed, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So I understand that a lot of people aren't going to know what the Export-Import Bank is. Probably the only exposure that anybody's had to the Export-Import Bank is probably a Seinfeld episode, but there's a little bit more to it. So it's not nearly as well known as the Federal Reserve, but it's still an important part of the U.S. economy, right? Particularly in the area of exports, of American exports. Now, the bank functions as the export credit agency of the United States, and in many ways it functions as somewhat of an insurance company more than it does an actual bank. Now, you have the Ex-Im Bank offering credit and financing for U.S. exports that may be considered too risky by the private sector. So in other words, let me just give you the brief outline and we'll get into this in more detail. So it offers credit and financing for exports that the free market, the private sector, might consider too risky. It also offers credit for exports that the private sector is just simply not willing to finance. So the general idea of this of the bank, the Export-Import Bank, is that it's there to facilitate exports in cases where, and the situations could precipitate this could be numerous, right? You can have international relations issues, international economic disturbances. The exporter may find it difficult to get decent loans from the private sector at a reasonable rate of interest, or any rate of interest, actually. The Export-Import Bank is there to facilitate exports in those cases, right? So if the transaction goes through according to plan, the money changes hands from the buyer to the seller, the bank makes a profit. If the buyer receives the goods and refuses to pay, the bank absorbs the cost and the seller survives, right? So there's three programs that the bank runs. One, it can make direct loans to foreign buyers of U.S. exports. It can also make loans to banks that lend to foreign buyers. And it can also make loan guarantees to other banks which are making working capital loans to U.S. exporters for the purpose of procuring funds for salaries, materials, etc. So that's what it's doing. So let's expand on this a little bit so people understand what it does. An exporter in the United States, let's say North Carolina, an exporter in North Carolina wants to build this type of machinery and send it to South Carolina. Well, the odds are that buyer in South Carolina is going to pay. In fact, there's really no need for a loan situation because it's fairly close. It's in the same country. There's not a problem. Now, if you have a manufacturer in North Carolina who wants to ship goods to Canada, it's much the same situation. You want to ship goods to Germany? Well, you may have to get a loan for shipping, but with the German market and the German laws and the German society, you're generally likely to get paid. Now, if you want to ship those same goods to Zimbabwe or Afghanistan or Nicaragua, something like that, the odds of the buyer receiving the goods and not paying are greater, right? In other words, it's a much bigger risk to ship goods and make a transaction, when you're crossing national borders, it's much easier to make transactions in your own country or in Western countries, European countries, than it is in the third world. You're much more likely to get stiffed if you ship these goods to the third world. Now, so that manufacturer realizes that there's this possibility. So the manufacturer needs to get a loan or a loan guarantee. So he goes to the private sector, and the private sector looks at it and says, this is too risky, right? You want to send these pieces of machinery to Nicaragua. We're not sure about the buyer. This is a little bit sketchy, so instead of 3% interest, we're going to charge 25% interest. Of course, that's ridiculous, right? You can't do that, especially if the seller gets stiffed. Well, the Export-Import Bank will step in. The Export-Import Bank says, all right, well, we'll offer a reasonable loan guarantee. This could be, 3%, 5%, 10%, whatever, but most likely it's going to be lower, say 3%, 4%, 5%, something like that. So this facilitates an export that would not have happened otherwise. That's what the Export-Import Bank does. And again, in those 4 programs really that I just mentioned, this could be a loan guarantee to the seller or a loan directly to the seller. It could also be a loan to the foreign buyer, so that it could make a loan to the foreign buyer so it could pay the U.S. seller. It can make loans to banks that lend to the foreign buyers, or it can make loans to banks which are working with U.S. exporters. There's a number of ways it can do it, but essentially it acts as an insurance company for U.S. exports. Now, let's talk about the criticism of the bank. There are accusations of corporate welfare and cronyism. Well, all right, that typically is just political football. This is just Republicans and Democrats being Republicans and Democrats and needing an issue to leap on that draws attention away from their own corruption and their own cronyism. And also it gives them an opportunity to work for Wall Street. This is what Wall Street wants to do. They want to get rid of these things. So you also got to ask yourself, what agency in the government, what government agency isn't entirely infested with corruption? I mean, look at Congress. I mean, should we do away with Congress because it's infested with the corruption? And why should we hold the Ex-Im Bank to a different standard? So the bigger question is whether or not the bank really exists for its stated purpose, right, promoting U.S. exports, or whether it just exists to subsidize major international corporations, like Boeing specifically. Now, we've got, what is a fact is that the Export-Import Bank has made a number of questionable decisions in the past regarding these loans and loan guarantees. For instance, we had the bank being heavily involved in making loans to projects maintained by Enron shortly before Enron's bankruptcy. We also had the bank providing a lot of loans and loan guarantees to big corporations like Boeing, like General Electric, Caterpillar. And we got the fact that loans to large companies do make up the bulk of the dollars loaned by the bank. The top 10% of loan recipients made up about 97% of the dollar amount of loans issued by the bank. So the dollar amount of what the bank loans is somewhat lopsided. So you got this the ability to make a case that there's some corruption here, there's some subsidy of large corporations, but you got to look at the reality of the situation, right? So on the Enron question, one should point out that even though the bank did fund a number of projects by Enron, to my knowledge, the bank was not adversely affected by the Enron bankruptcy. Now, whatever one could argue regarding the corruption involved of funding these Enron projects, the fact is the bank didn't lose by funding the projects because the projects were subsidiaries, basically, but they were also independent to some degree, and most of them ended up paying back the money they got from the bank. Now, you've also got this question of GE and Boeing and so forth. So you got Boeing, GE, all these other companies that are really, they're products of the Wall Street gambling economy. They're products of the police state, this technological control grid, the war economy, the permanent war economy, I should say. So that's a fact. These companies are a part of that. But at the same time, you have to have large industry in your economy. Small businesses are great, and they've got to be kept alive. But at the same time, you've also got to have large industry. So it's vital to a national economy to have that, to have large business and large commerce. And it's, in many ways, in the modern world, it is as essential as is the small business and individual commerce. So you can't criticize the Ex-Im Bank solely on the grounds that it provides credit to large industry, because that there's nothing wrong with having large industry. But at the same time, of course, you can't have it subsidizing large industry. But let's go into this topic a little more. So you have Kyle McCarthy writing here for the United Front Against Austerity, and he writes an article about the Ex-Im Bank. Let me I've got a link to that in my article, but let's just talk about GE for a second, General Electric. In 2011, we had GE bidding against a Chinese company on a $477 million contract to export U.S.-made locomotives to Pakistan. Now, the buyer wanted the GE locomotives because it's American-made, and at this time, American-made goods are still better than anywhere else in the world. So, well, maybe not the Germans, but it's right on par. Still some of the best stuff in the world made here. Now, China, the Pakistani contract that was being debated over, GE got undercut by lower prices from the Chinese company. And ironically, because they were aided by the Chinese aggressive Export-Import Bank. The U.S. Export-Import Bank stepped up, matched the Chinese financing, and got the contract for GE. And it also kept workers in Erie, Pennsylvania and Fort Worth, Texas working. Right? So that's an example of how the Export-Import Bank works. Now, back to the loan amount, the dollar amount that I mentioned earlier that seems so skewed toward major companies. Although the actual amount of dollars provided by the bank, just in terms of loans, loan guarantees, and so forth, the actual amount of dollars does tend to go to large institutions. About 90% of the bank's customers are small firms. So what the bank gives up in terms of actual monetary value in the money that it gives to large firms, it makes it up in the quantity of smaller businesses. So 90% of the dollars go to big business, but 90% of the customers are actually small business. So you've got that. It's not set up simply for the benefit of these large corporations, but for the benefit of the U.S. economy as a whole, right? So let's look at August of 2013. The Export-Import Bank provided credit insurance for Preferred Popcorn of Nebraska. Now, that's a farmer-owned company. It's only had a handful of employees, but it was able to sell its product to 60 different countries around the world, right? And as a result of that, the sales got higher, the sales jumped up, and the company was able to hire more workers, right? So basically, the reason you have this situation in terms of the bank's loans are because big businesses manufacture and export more goods. And for that reason, they use more dollar denominations of credit, right? We have, let's see, I'm trying to get the numbers here. In 2013, the bank had 2,778 industrial and agricultural businesses as customers. So in 2013, last year, 2,778 industrial and agricultural businesses were served by the bank. Of those 2,778 customers, 2,160 were small businesses. So the argument that it only favors big business doesn't work, because that's not the case. Now, aside from the aid that Preferred Popcorn got and the potential that the bank has in terms of jump-starting the economy and aiding American exports even more, the idea of whether or not it's a risk to taxpayers, this is something we're going to talk about. Now, despite being a bank, the Export-Import Bank is nowhere near the bloated federal agency that we're being told that it is, right? We have a $3.5 trillion U.S. budget. The Export-Import Bank only makes up $90 million of that, so it's pretty small. It only has about 400 employees nationwide within the entire structure of the bank, so that's not a big bloated industry. And here's the kicker, right? The U.S. taxpayer does not pay 1 single cent for any of the cost of the bank, right? All of the bank's costs, operating costs, employees, all that kind of stuff, it's paid by the fees and interest from the bank's customers. In 2013, for instance, we just been talking about 2013, the bank turned a $1.1 billion profit, which it paid back into the federal treasury. So you got to ask all these congressmen, for instance, even with the libertarians, who say, government's bloated, it's big, it doesn't know how to run anything, because if you had a businessman there, they could do so much better because they could make it turn a profit and all that kind of stuff. It's flawed reasoning to begin with. But when they have an institution like the Ex-Im Bank that is making money, that's making $1 billion, they want to end it. They still want to end it. And that should tell you what these people are, right? So let's look. The Congressional Research Service, they did a study here, and they determined that despite the world economic depression, the bank has paid for itself since 2008. In 2006, or since 2006, the bank only had a default rate that was less than 1%. So that's a pretty good rate of default rate there of its customers. So just look at some statistics here. In 2013, the agency, Ex-Im Bank, authorized $27.3 billion in direct loans, loan guarantees, and credit insurance. Loan guarantees were $14.9 billion. Direct loans were $6.9 billion. Again, since 2006, the default rate was less than 1%. And let's see what we have here. Here's the Congressional Research Service given an example of a transaction in 2013. Here's a good example. $155 million loan to Ghana for a hospital expansion supported by U.S. engineering and construction firms. Here's another. $1.1 billion loan guarantee to an Indonesian airline to buy Boeing jets. Here's another. $694 million loan to an Australian company for U.S. mining and rail equipment from Caterpillar and General Electric. Look at what this does for U.S. exports. But even more so, look at what it does for human progress, right? And to think that this bank is being wasted and that someone wants to end it. So why do they want to really end the bank? Why? So the argument of it's not a business, it's not run by a business like a business can't be used here, because it is, right? It is very successful. Let me talk about why they want to end the bank on the other side. Ladies and gentlemen, stay with us. This is Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. We'll be right back after this.
We're sitting down with Michael Scheuer, the man who had served in the CIA for more than 20 years, up until 2004. At one time, he was the chief of the CIA bin Laden unit. Then he went and exposed how counter-effective Washington's methods were in the fight against terror. Bin Laden is gone. Who is Washington's number one enemy now?
Washington's enemy is an enemy that doesn't exist. We're fighting an Islamic enemy that Washington believes is out to kill us because we have elections, because we're free, because we have women in the workplace. It's an enemy that doesn't exist. It didn't exist when bin Laden was alive. It doesn't exist now. America is being attacked because of its foreign policy in the Muslim world, because of its support for Israel, because of its support for the Saudi police state, because of its presence on the Arab Peninsula. And until we accept that, until Americans can say to each other, whether you support aid to Israel or not, our relationship with Israel is causing this war, we are not going to be able to defeat this enemy. And Israel itself as a country is not the problem. The real problem is the leaders of the Jewish American community in the United States who influence and corrupt our Congress to support Israel when we have no interest there.
You imply that the Israeli lobby is dragging the United States into the wars, into
Absolutely.
the conflicts?
They're absolutely dragging us in.
For more news, visit pigminenews.com.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.tv.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. Before the break, we were discussing the Export-Import Bank, and we need to wrap this up because we got to get into Syria and we got to talk about Ukraine and all that kind of stuff too. But I want to focus on this bank issue for a second because this is sort of a microcosm, right? The real reason the bank is being attacked, right? I said before that the sort of the right-wing condemnation of the bank, which is that it's a waste to taxpayers. It puts taxpayers on the hook. That's not true, right? And that it's corporate welfare. Well, that's not true. They don't have a problem with that. Any of those things. The corporate welfare are the Democrats and Republicans, and of course taxpayer expense. The Democrats and Republicans are responsible for that too. But not get off topic. The idea that government isn't a business, you can't, government's not going to turn profits and stuff. Well, the bank made $1 billion last year, and it paid it into the U.S. Treasury. So I would ask the Congress, I would ask Hensarling and Grayson, what the hell have you done to equal $1.1 billion for the American people? You haven't done anything because you're a parasite. The Export-Import Bank is not a parasite like Ellen Grayson and Bernie Sanders and Jeb Hensarling, right? So why do they really want to attack this bank? If it's bringing in money, if it's aiding U.S. exports, why do they want to get rid of it? Well, I'll tell you. The reason they want to get rid of it is because there is an agenda of deindustrialization. There's an agenda of globalization, right? This is what brought us GATT. This is what brought us NAFTA. This is what brought us a series of trade agreements with China, with South Korea, with South America, with Central America, with India, with Europe, with virtually every country on the earth except for the ones that we're bombing. The goal is to completely deindustrialize countries in the West where workers have just had some modicum of rights and benefits and compensatory pay. Labor is to be moved offshore, right? The agenda here is to move labor offshore to countries where the cost of production is cheap, where labor is cheap, where they don't have labor laws, they don't have a minimum wage, that sort of thing. I know that sends libertarians into seizures because we talk about having a minimum wage. Well, we shouldn't have a minimum wage. I'll have to agree with you, libertarians. But where we disagree is that you don't think there should be any safeguards. I don't want a minimum wage. I want a living wage. And that's a hell of a lot more than $7.25 an hour. But we'll get to that shortly as well. So the idea here, the deindustrialization agenda, right? The producers, the actual producers are to be abused in the process. And by the actual producers, I mean the labor, the workers, right? The deindustrialization agenda has to see living standards reduced worldwide, not just in the West. And this is going to be the de-scientification, I guess, right? The lack of progress for the general public in terms of science and development. So the world oligarchy, of course, is going to sit on this huge global economy where there's high sciences that provide them with high living standards and advanced health care and life extension and leisure and all that kind of stuff. Where most of the overwhelming majority of the population, which will be reduced at some point, will just be living in sort of the Hunger Games lifestyle. So if you want to industrialize the United States, and I'm not going to go into this too much because I think this has been documented in a lot of other books and a lot of other documentaries, and I think this information is out there, the deindustrialization agenda. But if you're going to do that, what's it going to look like? And what's it going to look like is the elimination of any protectionism for American economy, the elimination of any dirigistic behavior and policies and institutions. All of those will be destroyed. Protective tariffs will be destroyed. National central banks will be destroyed. They'll be privatized, right? The Export-Import Bank, that will be eliminated. And the reason I get so hard on libertarians, the reason I'm so hard on them is because I think that the overwhelming majority of them are good people, and I think that they're well-meaning. And the thing is, I identify with them on so many levels, whether it's gun control, whether it's the drug war, whether it's civil liberties in general, or the ability to travel without having a stupid permit to drive on the road that you paid taxes to build and maintain, and now you have to buy a permit to drive on it, to travel on it. Excuse me, there's a difference. And then pay property taxes on the vehicle that you pay to keep up and take you to work, so you can pay more taxes. This is, I identify with the libertarians on so many issues, but although they may be well-meaning, and although we may identify on a lot of other issues, the economic part of it is absolutely insane, and it was funded into existence by David Rockefeller, and it was funded by big bankers, right? That's all it is. It's a huge scam. This von Mises crap, this von Hayek, it's all garbage. Ayn Rand, what an awful person. What a terrible, awful, wretched person, Ayn Rand. If anybody would use Ayn Rand as an example of positive economy and any kind of ethics whatsoever, I mean, I got to question that person's mental sanity. So what I'm trying to get across to you is the answer is not eliminating the social safety net and just ending the Federal Reserve and ending the Export-Import Bank. The answer is nationalizing the Fed and taxing Wall Street to pay for social safety net programs and funding the Export-Import Bank and protective tariffs. Because at the height of this country's economic power, it was not during the years of laissez-faire capitalism. It was not during the American Industrial Revolution. No, it was not. That was the time of weave room girls and child labor and 14, 15, 16-hour days in factories in atrocious conditions and short lifespans. The only reason you can go to work and reasonably be expected to work a 40-hour week and be paid time and a half for anything else is because of the labor movement, not because of libertarianism. The American economic power, the height of its economic power, was in the early 1950s. Early to mid-1950s. And let me go on record and say I don't like Roosevelt, but that was on the tail of the New Deal. So, and a lot of the good portions, of course, got eroded away, and all the negative government-controlled socialist aspects of it got kept. But it wasn't libertarianism that built the greatest economic machine. It wasn't Austrian school economics that built the greatest economic machine in the world. the Germans tried Austrian economics, was where it comes from, right? And the only thing they got out of that was Hitler. So you gotta be smarter about this and stop buying into this laissez-faire capitalist lie. You talk about the IMF, for instance, and I'll get back to the bank in a second, but I just want to point out that you got the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And the reason I'm so hard on libertarians is because you'll hear libertarians say, we oppose austerity. Well, they don't know what austerity means, because libertarian economics are austerity. They're the exact same thing as the IMF. Same thing in practice, maybe a couple different ideological differences, maybe in a few different practical things, technical details that are different, but in practice, they're the same thing. And I think the overwhelming majority of libertarians would reject that if they understood what it means, because I think the overwhelming majority of libertarians simply want freedom, and they want to be able to move around and not have a government agent up their ass every time they turn around. But we'll talk about more of this economic theory later. So we got to talk about the Export-Import Bank. I really got to wrap this up because we got to get to Syria. But the Export-Import Bank, here's another problem, right? Other countries have their own versions of the Export-Import Bank. We've got China that I just mentioned has its own Export-Import Bank. It's called the Export-Import Bank of the Republic of China. We've also got India that has their bank as well. Australia, Russia, about 60 other countries have an Export-Import Bank. And basically, if the United States ended its Export-Import Bank, the U.S. would just once again be handicapping itself in the field of international trade. This is not by accident. You don't open your borders to global trade, to slave labor countries, and flood your own economy with cheap crap from a country built on slave labor and abuse of its workers. And then you wonder why the economy goes down, and your answer is more free trade. Come on, this is not an accident. So, you want to handicap yourself some more, get rid of the Export-Import Bank? Congratulations. Good job. So, all right, we got this Export-Import Bank competitiveness reports, and these are released by the Ex-Im Bank every year. They show the competitiveness in terms of the credit and so forth. The report here stated that last year, 2013, $14.5 billion in new export credit for American manufacturers was issued. That was actually a steep drop from 2012, so they're already reducing the amount of loan guarantees coming from the Ex-Im Bank. But Germany, however, to the American $14.5 billion. Germany had $22.6 billion. Korea had $14.8 billion. Korea had $14.8 billion. Korea had more Export-Import Bank investment in Korean industry than Americans did in American industry. China had $45.5 billion. So that should tell you something. So China's using theirs, but we're going to get rid of ours. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Unless you're trying to intentionally destroy the American economy, and they are. So, despite the questions of some corruption or disproportionate lending and that sort of thing, you got to take a look at that. But I don't think it's as serious as is being made out. But I'm sure there is lots of corruption. Again, it's a government agency. Of course, it's rife with the corruption. So we've got to reduce the amount of corruption in the bank. But the bank itself supports an average of 205,000 to 1.2 million American jobs. You want to eliminate the bank, you put these jobs at risk in a worldwide economic depression. We cannot have knee-jerk reactions that says, oh, the bank may be corrupt, so we have to end it. This is like saying the Federal Reserve is a central bank, and banks are evil, so we got to end the Federal Reserve. No, you don't end the Federal Reserve. That's knee-jerk. That's simple. That's simplicity. You nationalize the Fed. You nationalize it. Getting rid of a profitable, dirigistic institution like the Ex-Im Bank, that is foolishness. At best, it's foolishness. And it's the intentional deindustrialization agenda at work. At worst, and that's actually what it is. So, it doesn't have to be the way it is, right? We don't have to have a worldwide economic depression. There are a number of solutions, and I've gone through them before. 1% Wall Street sales tax, nationalize the Federal Reserve, protective tariffs, parity agriculture, that sort of thing. We'll talk more about that in the future. But I want you to go read my article. It's called The Hidden Bipartisan Agenda Behind Eliminating the Export-Import Bank. It's up at Activist Post and my website, BrandonTurbeville.com. And you'll be able to look at the details there. So I think I've covered this well enough. But now I wanted to get into the roots of ISIS, and I think maybe that I'll have to cover a lot of this next week, because we've only got, I think, about 10 minutes left, but I'll try to get into some of this. I mentioned at the beginning of the show's being recorded on September 10th, so it's the day before. Well, I'm sorry, not the day before. It's the few hours before, and I apologize for the noise, ladies and gentlemen, if you can hear that. We've got a very noisy street tonight. But September 10th, this is shortly before the Obama speech about his strategy against ISIS. Well, let me say before we get into the roots of ISIS that if you want to stop terrorism, if you want to stop ISIS marching across the Arab world, then you stop funding it, stop giving them arms, and stop training them, because that's the only solution to this. And of course, work with Assad, work with the Iraqi government once that gets reformed after we threw Maliki out. But work with existing governments to destroy these death squad fighters once and for all, and cut off funding to these people. Demand that the Saudis cut off funding. Demand that the Qataris cut off funding. Those are your solutions that you can take forward. But we'll see, again, by the time you hear this show, Obama will have given his strategy on ISIS. And since everybody's going to be talking about ISIS on 9/11, interestingly enough, which was an inside job, I can't say that enough, 9/11 was an inside job, but since everybody's going to be talking about ISIS, I think it's important to break down what ISIS is and where it came from. So, we've got a situation where the narrative about terrorism and the narrative about ISIS specifically is so convoluted now with the media, and it's Orwellian. We are at war with East Asia. We're not at war with East Asia. We're at war with Oceania. We're not at war with Oceania kind of strategy. The American people are just absolutely befuddled. They're confused. They're schizophrenic now. Well, schizophrenic's not the right word, but they just simply, they have attention deficit disorder with this stuff, right? So they finally reached the point that Brzezinski talked about where they completely rely on the media to do all of their thinking for them. Their opinions are not theirs. It's the opinions of the world oligarchy. But now, last year, where we had these Ghouta chemical weapons attacks that were blamed on Assad that turned out to actually be the death squads, the American people stood up and said, no, we don't want to go to war for this, right? Most Americans didn't really have an opinion. The vast majority of people never count for anything. But those that did, that paid attention, realized quickly that this is not something to start a war over. And it was apathetic resistance, but it was resistance nonetheless. We didn't go to war. Well, now you've got, less than a year later, or maybe, I guess a year later, almost to the month, you've got the American people who are essentially willing to go to war, willing to bomb Syria because of ISIS. They're scared of ISIS. Well, that's because we've got this situation where we say Assad's the bad guy. Well, Al-Qaeda's the bad guy. And then Al-Qaeda's the good guy. And then Al-Qaeda's the bad guy against Gaddafi. But then Al-Qaeda's the bad guy when we want to stick our hands down your pants at the airport. Then Al-Qaeda's the good guy against Assad. But then Al-Qaeda's the bad guy because he's going to blow things up here in the U.S. But Al-Qaeda's a good guy because he's after Assad. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. Then they change the names. They change the names, and the people can't keep up with it because people only have an attention span that lasts 5 minutes. And they're too busy watching Dancing with the Stars or whatever crap passes for entertainment on TV now. I don't know, like, Who Wants to Be a Twerking Star or something like that. I don't know, whatever's on TV now. Or they've got football stats. It's football season now, so all of our masculinity will be channeled into a television set and football games. So the American people, they're just out to lunch. But we got to talk about ISIS. What is ISIS? Since ISIS is the root of all evil, right? ISIS is the new Osama bin Laden. Well, in terms of Syria and Iraq, we've got to look at the fact that Obama continues to say moderate opposition. In fact, he recently said that they were looking to expand airstrikes. There would be airstrikes. But he also said that they're looking to expand aid to the moderate opposition. Now that's a very interesting statement, right? Because essentially what he's saying is that, this speech is either going to be more talking points, right? Just typical Obama warmongering, back and forth garbage, the same thing we saw with Bush for 8 years. Or he's saying that we're going to strengthen, we're going to look at, I'm trying to give you the quote. I'm bumbling back and forth here because I was trying to buy myself time where I could find the quote. But all right, here it goes. Obama's quote on Meet the Press, NBC. He says, in terms of controlling territory, we're going to have to develop a moderate Sunni opposition that control territory and that we can work with. The notion that the United States should be putting boots on the ground, I think, would be a profound mistake, and I want to be very clear and very explicit about that. All right, so he says no boots on the ground. Well, he said that before, and now we've got almost 1,200 American personnel in Iraq. So Obama is, an inveterate liar, so we can't believe anything he says. But what I want to drive home is that he says we have to develop a moderate Sunni opposition. Well, that's interesting, because what the hell have you been doing for the last 3 years? Because all I've heard for the last 3 years is that we have a moderate Sunni opposition to Assad. So Obama is admitting one of two things: that there is an opposition that is not moderate, or that we haven't been funding the moderates, meaning we've been funding the death squads, the fanatics. The truth is that there are no moderates to fund, and there never were. The idea of a moderate opposition to Assad was a fairy tale from the very beginning. It was a lie. The Arab Spring, as it came to Syria, was never peaceful. It was always violent. The first day, the first time those boots hit the ground, there were snipers, there were death squads, there were killings, it was violence. Assad's biggest mistake was that he didn't send tanks and military personnel in quick enough to execute them. But the Western media would have you believe it's a total police state. So there's no moderates in Syria. So the idea here is that the West has armed and funded Al-Qaeda and other groups, I guess we should say, since as early as 2005. In fact, we could technically go back to, say, the 90s, but we'll say at least 2005. And it's an attempt, like, obviously, to overthrow Syria, but it's also an attempt to overthrow the government in Lebanon as well, and of course in Iraq, and it's to break the the Shiite crescent there, and the growing alliances between Iraq and Iran and Syria. This, of course, is all a stepping stone to a confrontation with Iran, which is a stepping stone to a confrontation with Russia. So let me read you a quote from Ben Hubbard, who wrote from the New York Times in April 2013. This should be mainstream enough for you. It This is Ben Hubbard's quote. He says, "In Syria's largest city, Aleppo, rebels aligned with al-Qaeda control the power plant, run the bakeries, and hit a court that applies Islamic law. Elsewhere, they have seized government oil fields, put employees back to work, and now profit from the crude they produce. Across Syria, rebel-held areas are dotted with Islamic courts staffed by lawyers and clerics and by fighting brigades led by extremists. Even the Supreme Military Council, the umbrella rebel organization whose formation the West had hoped would sideline radical groups, is stocked with commanders who want to infuse Islamic law into a future Syrian government." That's your Free Syrian Army. By the way, the Supreme Military Council. So it's stocked with commanders who want to infuse Islamic law into a future Syrian government. In other words, extremists, fanatics, fundamentalists. Here's the important part of the Ben Hubbard quote. "Nowhere in rebel-controlled Syria is there a secular fighting force to speak of." 2013 New York Times. That's right. There never was. We even had the Free Syrian Army commander, one of the Free Syrian Army commanders, Basil Idris, right? This is not Salam Idris, this is Basil Idris. He recently admitted that the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, the moderate rebels, the moderate groups that we are supporting, collaborates with ISIS and collaborates with al-Nusra. Very moderate, aren't they? We've got Idris. He stated this is his quote from an interview with Daily Star of Lebanese media. "We are collaborating with the Islamic State and the Nusra Front by attacking the Syrian army's gatherings in Qalamun. Let's face it, the Nusra Front is the biggest power present right now in Qalamun, and we as FSA would collaborate on any mission they launch as long as it coincides with our values." He goes on to say, "ISIS wanted to enhance its presence in the western Qalamun area. After the fall of Yabrud and the FSA's retreat into the hills around Arsal, many units pledged allegiance to ISIS." FSA pledges allegiance to ISIS. Abu Fida, right? He's a retired Syrian army colonel who's now part of the Revolutionary Council, another death squad brigade in Qalamun. He says, quote, "A very large number of FSA members in Arsal have joined ISIS and Nusra. In the end, people want to eat, they want to live, and the Islamic State has everything," end quote. So we've also got the Syrian Revolutionary Front, the FSA, they're all working with Nusra and al-Qaeda. And we've got Jamal Maruf, right? He admitted that his brigades also coordinate with Nusra and al-Qaeda on a regular basis. Now, we've got to stop here because we've got no more time left for the show. We'll pick this up next week and talk about the roots of ISIS. Ladies and gentlemen, please check out BrandonTurbeville.com. Truth on the Tracks every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY.TV. This has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
Even before I came into office, I was very clear that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we did some things that were wrong. We did a whole lot of things that were right, but we tortured some folks.
For more news, visit pigminenews.com.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.TV.